Picture a clay tablet buried beneath the Iraqi desert for 4,000 years, cuneiform symbols pressed into wet clay by hands that turned to dust millennia ago, words waiting in absolute darkness. When archaeologists finally pulled these tablets from the earth in the 1800s and learned to read the wedge-shaped script, they found something nobody expected. Stories. Stories about gods who walked the earth, gods who fought each other, gods who created humans for reasons that had nothing to do with love, and gods who decided in a moment of rage and fear to wipe humanity out completely with a flood that would drown the world. We all know the flood story, Noah and the ark, a righteous man, a wrathful God, and rain that wouldn't stop. Sunday school stuff. But what if that's not the real story? What if the Great Flood wasn't divine judgment at all, but collateral damage, the byproduct of a war, a conflict between factions of beings the Sumerians called the Anunnaki, gods who weren't entirely divine and whose battles reshaped the face of the earth itself? If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these. So subscribe and drop a comment telling me where you are and what time it is. I love seeing Tokyo at dawn, London at lunch, Los Angeles at lights out, all at once. Makes the ancient world feel a little less distant when we're all here together. Here's what we know for certain. Sumeria appeared in southern Mesopotamia around 4,500 BCE, and it's the oldest civilization we have records from. Not the oldest culture, not the first humans to build cities, but the first to write things down in a way we can still read. And what they wrote down is deeply strange. They didn't claim their knowledge came from gradual discovery or human innovation. They said it was given to them, taught by the Anunnaki, beings who came from somewhere else, beings with powers that looked like magic, but which the Sumerians described with the matter-of-fact tone you'd use to describe your neighbour. The Anunnaki weren't portrayed as distant, abstract forces. They were personalities. They had family drama, political factions, jealousies. They fell in love, had children, made mistakes. They built cities and destroyed them. And according to the oldest versions of the flood story, versions that predate the Bible by over 1,000 years, they argued violently about what to do with humanity. Some wanted us dead. Others wanted us saved. The flood wasn't punishment for human sin. It was a weapon deployed by one faction of Anunnaki against another's project. You know that feeling when you stumble across information that doesn't fit the official story? When details line up in ways that make you question what you were taught? That's what happened when scholars started translating Sumerian texts. The biblical flood narrative suddenly had a prehistoric blueprint. Same event, completely different context. And buried in clay tablets with names like the Aridogenesis and the Atrahasis epic were accounts of divine councils, genetic experiments, and wars in heaven that sound less like mythology and more like redacted history. Tonight, we're going into those records. We're going to walk through the Sumerian accounts step by step, name by name, tablet by tablet. We'll meet Enlil, the god who decreed humanity's destruction. Enki, his brother, who committed treason to save us. We'll explore why the Anunnaki created humans in the first place, and what made them regret it so deeply that annihilation seemed like the only option. We'll trace the factions, the conflicts, the moment when divine disagreement turned into catastrophe. This isn't about proving ancient aliens or rewriting history. It's about sitting with the oldest stories our species wrote down and asking what if they remembered something? What if the flood myths that appear in over 200 cultures worldwide aren't just metaphor, but fragments of actual events seen through the eyes of survivors who had no modern framework to describe what they'd witnessed? So settle in. Let the ancient world wash over you. We're going back, way back, to before the flood, when gods walked among humans and the fate of our entire species hung on the outcome of a war we barely understood. Around 4500 BCE, something extraordinary happened in southern Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. A civilization appeared, not slowly, not gradually building on thousands of years of visible cultural development, just appeared. Like someone flipped a switch and suddenly there were cities, writing, mathematics, organized religion, complex agriculture, and legal systems sophisticated enough to make modern lawyers nod in appreciation. These were the Sumerians, and they represent one of the most baffling puzzles in archaeological history. Here's why they're so puzzling. Civilizations don't just pop up overnight. They're supposed to evolve slowly. You start with simple villages, maybe a few hundred people growing crops and raising animals. Over centuries, those villages get bigger. Eventually, you get towns. After thousands of years of gradual development, if you're lucky and conditions are right, you might get a city. Writing systems take forever to develop. You start with simple pictographs, gradually refining them over many generations. Mathematics requires centuries of accumulated observation and abstraction. Astronomy demands generations of sky watchers patiently recording celestial movements. Law codes emerge slowly from customary practices that solidify into formal rules. That's how civilization is supposed to work. That's how it worked in Egypt, in China, in Mesoamerica. Everywhere we look, we see the archaeological evidence of slow, gradual development, except in Sumer. The Sumerians seem to have skipped all the preliminary steps. Their earliest cities, places like Eridu, Uruk, and Ur, aren't primitive settlements slowly growing into urban centers. They're sophisticated from the start. Complex architecture, advanced irrigation systems, organized temples, administrative structures. It's like watching someone sit down at a piano and immediately play a concerto without ever having practiced scales. Their writing system, cuneiform, appears around 3200 BCE, already remarkably developed. Yes, it evolved over time, becoming more abstract and efficient. But the earliest examples aren't simple scratches in clay. They're already a functional writing system capable of recording complex information, inventory lists, religious texts, mathematical calculations. Within a few centuries, they're writing poetry, historical records, and legal documents. Other cultures took thousands of years to reach similar levels of written sophistication. The Sumerians seem to have gotten there in what amounts to a historical eye blink. Their mathematics was equally precocious. The Sumerians developed a base 60-number system that was so effective we still use remnants of it today. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. They could perform complex calculations involving multiplication, division, even early forms of algebra and geometry. They calculated the areas of irregular fields for taxation purposes. They computed the volumes of granaries. They developed standardized weights and measures that remained in use for thousands of years. This wasn't primitive counting. This was sophisticated mathematics that wouldn't be surpassed for millennia. Their astronomical knowledge was even more remarkable. The Sumerians could predict lunar eclipses. They identified the planets and tracked their movements across the sky. They divided the heavens into constellations, many of which we still recognize today. They understood that the Earth was spherical at a time when most humans thought the world was flat. They knew the precession of the equinoxes, a phenomenon that takes 26,000 years to complete. How do you discover something that takes 26,000 years to observe unless someone already knew and told you? In agriculture, they developed irrigation systems of staggering complexity. Canals, levees, reservoirs, all carefully engineered to control water flow from the rivers to the fields. They understood crop rotation, letting fields lie fallow to recover fertility. They domesticated dozens of plant and animal species. They created the first organized agriculture capable of producing surplus food on a scale large enough to support cities of tens of thousands of people. This shouldn't have been possible without centuries of trial and error, yet they seem to implement these systems almost immediately. Their legal codes are perhaps most surprising of all. The Code of Ur-Nammu, dating to around 2100 BCE, is the oldest known law code in history. But it's not primitive. It distinguishes between different types of crimes, establishes proportional punishments, protects the rights of widows and orphans, regulates economic transactions. It's sophisticated jurisprudence that assumes centuries of legal tradition behind it. Yet we find no evidence of that tradition. It just appears, fully formed, like everything else in Sumerian civilization. So archaeologists and historians have a problem. Where did all this knowledge come from? The standard explanation is that there must have been a long developmental period that we simply haven't found evidence for yet. Maybe the early villages are buried too deep, or were built with materials that didn't survive. Maybe future excavations will reveal the missing evolutionary steps. It's a reasonable hypothesis, and it might be correct. But the Sumerians themselves offered a different explanation. According to their own records, written on thousands of clay tablets, they didn't develop any of this themselves. They were taught. Everything they knew, all their sciences and technologies, all their agricultural and architectural knowledge, all their writing and mathematics and astronomy, all of it was given to them by beings they called the Anunnaki. The Anunnaki. The name appears over and over in Sumerian texts, sometimes translated as those who from heaven came to earth, or those of royal blood. According to Sumerian records, these were divine beings who descended from the heavens in the distant past and established civilization in Mesopotamia. They taught humans how to build cities, how to write, how to measure time and land, how to organize society. They gave humanity the gift of civilization itself. Now you might think these were just gods, mythological beings invented to explain the world like Zeus or Odin. And maybe that's exactly what they were. But the Sumerians didn't describe the Anunnaki the way most cultures describe their gods. These weren't abstract cosmic forces or anthropomorphized natural phenomena. The tablets described them as physical beings who walked among humans, who had families and conflicts, who ate and drank and travelled, who built structures and operated machines, who came from somewhere else and could return there. The records are detailed, obsessively detailed. The Sumerians kept lists of the Anunnaki, their names, their functions, their relationships to each other. They described where they lived, what they did, how they interacted with humanity. Thousands of tablets recovered from the ruins of Sumerian cities like Nippur and Ur, and later from the great library of Nineveh in Assyria, all tell variations of the same stories. This wasn't casual mythology. This was their history, recorded and preserved with the same care they use for tax records and property boundaries. The library at Nineveh alone contained over 30,000 clay tablets when it was discovered in the 19th century. Many were copies of much older Sumerian texts, preserved and recopied by Assyrian scribes who wanted to maintain knowledge from the ancient past. These weren't religious texts in the sense we usually mean. They were administrative records, king lists, astronomical observations, medical treatises, agricultural manuals, all of them referring back to knowledge that came from the Anunnaki. King lists that stretch back not just decades or centuries, but tens of thousands of years, describing rulers who supposedly reigned for thousands of years each before a great flood devastated the land. After the flood, the texts say, kingship descended from heaven once again, and human civilization was re-established with the help of the surviving Anunnaki. Agricultural texts describing irrigation techniques and crop management in such detail that modern engineers have been impressed by their sophistication, all attributed to teachings from the Anunnaki. astronomical texts recording celestial movements, and predicting eclipses using mathematics that wouldn't be independently rediscovered until the Renaissance. Knowledge they claimed came from the Anunnaki, medical texts describing surgical procedures, pharmaceutical preparations, diagnostic techniques, all gifts from the Anunnaki. This presents us with a genuine mystery. Were the Sumerians recording actual history or elaborate mythology? The mainstream archaeological interpretation is clear. These were stories, metaphors, ways of organizing and explaining a complex world. The Anunnaki were gods in the traditional sense, supernatural beings invented to give meaning to natural phenomena and social structures. The sophisticated knowledge of the Sumerians must have developed naturally, even if we haven't found all the evidence yet. But some researchers have asked uncomfortable questions. Why are the records so consistent across thousands of tablets and thousands of years? Why do they describe the Anunnaki in such physical, concrete terms rather than as abstract divine forces? Why do later Mesopotamian cultures, the Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians, all preserve and repeat the same stories with the same basic details? Why does the sophistication of Sumerian civilization appear so suddenly in the archaeological record? What if the Sumerians were recording something that actually happened? Not necessarily exactly as they described it. Cultures always interpret events through their own understanding. But what if there's a kernel of historical truth buried in these texts? What if beings the Sumerians called Anunnaki really did exist, really did interact with early human civilization, really did impart knowledge that accelerated cultural development in Mesopotamia? It's a question that sits in that uncomfortable space between documented history and speculative possibility. We have the texts, we have the artifacts, we have the undeniable fact of Sumerian civilization's mysterious sophistication. What we don't have is certainty about what it all means. To understand the implications, we need to look closer at what the Sumerians actually wrote about the Anunnaki, who these beings supposedly were, where they came from, what they wanted, and most importantly for our story, what happened when their presence on Earth led to conflict, catastrophe, and a flood that nearly destroyed humanity entirely. Because according to Sumerian records, the Anunnaki didn't just give civilization to humanity, they also nearly took it away. The word itself feels heavy. Anunnaki. Say it slowly and you can almost hear the weight of millennia in each syllable. In the Sumerian language, the name means something like, those who from heaven to earth came, though translations vary depending on which scholar you ask and which text they're working from. Some render it as offspring of Anu, the Sky Father, linking them directly to the highest deity in the Sumerian pantheon. Others translate it more literally as princely offspring, or those of royal blood. But regardless of the exact translation, one thing is consistent across all the ancient texts. These weren't ordinary beings, these were the gods who shaped the world. But here's where it gets complicated. The Anunnaki weren't a monolithic group. They had hierarchy, factions, family drama that would make modern soap operas look peaceful. At the top of the divine pyramid sat Anu, sometimes spelled An, the Sky Father. He was the ultimate authority, the cosmic king who ruled from the highest heaven. But like many kings, Anu seemed to prefer staying in his palace, letting his children handle the messy business of actually running things, and his children were very busy. The most important of Anu's offspring were Enlil and Enki, and understanding these two is crucial to understanding everything that follows. Enlil, whose name means Lord of the Command or Lord of the Storm, was the executor, the one who made things happen. The tablets describe him as powerful, decisive, sometimes harsh. He was given dominion over the Earth's atmosphere, the space between heaven and earth where weather happened, where winds blew, where storms raged. In the divine hierarchy, Enlil was effectively the CEO, the one who turned Anu's decrees into reality. The tablets are clear about his authority. When Enlil spoke, things happened. When Enlil was angry, mountains trembled. Then there was Enki, called Ea in some texts, whose name translates roughly as Lord of the Earth or Lord of the Waters. Where Enlil was storm and command, Enki was wisdom and craft. The ancient texts describe him as the clever one, the problem solver, the god who understood the deep magic of creation. He was given dominion over the Abzu, the freshwater ocean that the Sumerians believed lay beneath the earth, the source of all springs and rivers. But his domain extended beyond water. Enki was the god of craftsmanship, of knowledge, of secrets. The tablets credit him with understanding the me, those mysterious divine principles or technologies that governed reality itself. When something required clever thinking rather than raw power, Enki was the one the other gods turned to. The tablets make it clear these two brothers didn't always see eye to eye. Their relationship was complicated, marked by cooperation, competition, and sometimes outright conflict. This tension between Enlil's power and Enki's wisdom runs through Sumerian mythology like a fault line, and it becomes crucial when we get to the flood story. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Below these great gods were the Anunnaki proper, the divine council, numbering 50 according to some texts, though other tablets suggest different numbers. These were the gods who actively managed the world, each with specific responsibilities. Some oversaw grain production, others managed livestock, still others were responsible for cities, crafts, or natural phenomena. It was a divine bureaucracy, complex and hierarchical. And then below the Anunnaki were the Igigi, the lesser gods, and their story is fascinating. The ancient texts describe the Igigi as a kind of divine labour force. They were the ones who did the actual work, the heavy lifting that kept the cosmos running. They dug canals, built structures, mined precious materials from the earth. For a long time, according to the tablets, this system worked. The Anunnaki gave orders. The Igigi carried them out. The universe functioned smoothly. But then something changed. The tablets tell us the Igigi grew weary. They had been labouring for thousands of years, the texts say, without rest, without relief. Their resentment built until it exploded into rebellion. They burned their tools, they marched on Enlil's temple, they demanded to be freed from their endless toil. This divine labour dispute becomes the catalyst for one of the most consequential decisions the Anunnaki ever made. But we'll come back to that. What's remarkable about these texts is how they describe the Anunnaki themselves. These weren't abstract cosmic forces or pure spiritual beings. The tablets portray them as having physical forms, wearing special garments, consuming food and drink. They had families, children. They felt emotions, rage, love, jealousy, fear. They made mistakes, changed their minds, suffered consequences for their actions. One text describes an Anunnaki god named Enlil becoming so enamored with a goddess that he essentially stalked her and was banished from the city of Nippur as punishment. Another tablet records a bitter dispute over water rights between two divine siblings that had to be arbitrated by their father. This is what makes the Anunnaki so unusual in ancient religious texts. Most pantheons of gods maintain some distance from human concerns, but the Anunnaki were portrayed almost as superhumans, beings with extraordinary abilities but recognizable emotions and motivations. They could live for vast spans of time, the tablets suggest, measuring their ages in what some scholars call divine years that don't correspond to human lifespans. They possessed technologies or abilities that seemed magical to the ancient Sumerians. They could fly through the air, the texts say, travelling between heaven and earth. They could communicate across vast distances. They wielded weapons that could devastate entire regions. This is where the modern debate gets really interesting. For traditional scholars, the Anunnaki are clearly mythological figures, cosmic principles given personality, ancestors transformed into gods through the haze of oral tradition and religious imagination. The fact that they're portrayed with human emotions just reflects how humans create gods in their own image, projecting familiar feelings onto cosmic forces they don't understand. But other researchers point out something curious. The level of detail in these texts, the specificity of the hierarchy, the careful records of genealogy and responsibility, it all seems remarkably bureaucratic for pure mythology. And then there's the me, those mysterious divine powers that the Anunnaki possessed and guarded jealously. The tablets describe the me as actual objects, things that could be stolen, transferred, lost. They gave whoever possessed them control over specific aspects of reality. Kingship was a me. Writing was a me. Metalworking was a me. Were these abstract concepts, or were they something more concrete? Some kind of technology that the ancient Sumerians couldn't properly describe? The texts themselves offer no clear answer. They simply record what they record. Gods who came from heaven to earth. Gods who laboured and loved and fought and made decisions that would change everything. Gods who were about to face the most difficult question of all. What do you do when your creation begins to rival your power? The Sumerian texts don't just describe gods who occasionally interfered in human affairs. They describe something far more complex and, frankly, far more believable if you're willing to entertain the possibility that these weren't myths at all. They describe a functioning government, a hierarchy with councils, disputes, voting procedures, and bitter political rivalries that would make modern parliamentary systems look simple by comparison. At the top of this divine hierarchy sat what the texts call the assembly of the gods. Not one supreme being making unilateral decisions, but a council of 7 senior deities who deliberated, argued, and voted on matters affecting both the divine realm and the world of humans below. This wasn't worship material invented to inspire reverence. This was bureaucracy. Pages and pages of text describing procedural debates, factional disputes, and political manoeuvring that read less like religious mythology and more like meeting minutes from a particularly contentious board of directors. The texts are oddly specific about how decisions were made. Major pronouncements required consensus or at least majority approval from the council. Individual gods, no matter how powerful, couldn't simply decree changes on their own authority. They had to present their cases, marshal support, build coalitions. When they failed to gain approval through legitimate channels, some resorted to manipulation, secret agreements, or outright defiance. Sound familiar? Because it should. This is how power actually works in complex hierarchies, whether we're talking about modern governments, corporate structures, or apparently councils of beings the Sumerians called gods. And at the heart of this divine government sat 2 brothers whose philosophical differences would eventually tear the council apart and doom humanity to near extinction. Their names were Enlil and Enki, and understanding their rivalry is essential to understanding what the texts say happened next. Enlil was the senior brother, the lord of the command, the enforcer of divine law and cosmic order. The texts describe him as stern, unbending, obsessed with maintaining hierarchy and discipline. When the council made a decision, Enlil ensured it was carried out, no exceptions, no mercy. He wasn't cruel for cruelty's sake. The texts actually portray him as principled, believing deeply that order must be maintained at all costs, that rules existed for reasons, that compassion, when misplaced, could threaten the stability of everything. Modern readers often interpret Enlil as a villain, but that's probably too simple. He was more like the strict authoritarian who genuinely believes that hard decisions, even terrible ones, are necessary for the greater good. The kind of leader who sees emotional attachment as weakness and views problems as things to be eliminated rather than solved. And his problem increasingly was going to be humanity. His brother Enki was his opposite in almost every way. Called the Lord of the Earth, the God of Wisdom, Enki was creative, curious, emotionally engaged with the world and its inhabitants. Where Enlil saw humans as a potential threat to divine order, Enki saw them as fascinating, perhaps even precious. The texts describe Enki as humanity's advocate, the one divine voice consistently arguing for mercy, for patience, for giving humans chances to correct their behavior rather than simply destroying them when they became inconvenient. But Enki's advocacy wasn't just soft-hearted sentiment. The texts suggest he had a personal stake in humanity's survival. Remember, many versions of the creation story name Enki as humanity's actual creator, the one who had mixed divine essence with earthly matter to fashion the first humans. They were, in a sense, his children, or at least his handiwork, and he wasn't about to let his brother destroy them without a fight. The tension between these two philosophies, order versus compassion, enforcement versus mercy, runs through the Sumerian texts like a fault line ready to rupture. Council meetings became battlegrounds. Enlil would present evidence of humanity's failings, their noise, their chaos, their multiplying numbers that threatened divine peace. Enki would counter with arguments about humanity's potential, their loyalty, their usefulness to the gods. Other council members would take sides, forming factions that shifted depending on the specific issue being debated. The texts mention another key figure in these deliberations, Ninmah, also called Ninhursag, the mother goddess. She occupied a unique position in the council, sometimes siding with Enlil, sometimes with Enki, but often trying to broker compromises between the warring brothers. Some versions of the text suggest she had been involved in humanity's creation alongside Enki, which gave her authority to speak on human matters. But she was also deeply committed to maintaining council unity, to preventing the kind of open schism that could destabilize divine government itself. For a long time, apparently, the system worked. Disputes were contained, compromises were reached. When humans became too numerous or too noisy, the gods would send plagues or famines, reducing populations to manageable levels without complete annihilation. Enki would accept these corrections as necessary. Enlil would accept that total extermination was politically untenable. Ninmah would ensure both brothers left the council chambers feeling heard, if not satisfied. But the texts make clear this balance was fragile, and becoming more so as humanity continued to grow, to spread, to become more sophisticated and possibly more troublesome. The council sessions grew more heated. Enlil's patience wore thinner. Enki's advocacy became more desperate. The factional divisions deepened. What's striking about these accounts is how unheroic they make the gods seem. There's no divine wisdom here, no transcendent morality. Just powerful beings struggling with governance, letting personal animosities influence policy decisions, allowing brotherly rivalry to escalate into existential crisis. If these texts are myths, they're remarkably cynical ones, portraying gods as fallible, political, driven by ego and emotion as much as principle. But if they're not myths, if they're garbled historical records of actual events, then what we're reading is something else entirely. We're reading about a leadership crisis among beings who had the power to reshape the world and who were about to use that power in the most catastrophic way imaginable. Because Enlil's patience was running out, and when it finally broke, when he decided that humanity had become an intolerable problem requiring a final solution, not even his brother's desperate advocacy would be enough to stop what came next. The council was about to make a decision that would drown the world. The Atrahasis epic tells a story that raises questions modern science still can't fully answer. Not about how humanity began in evolutionary terms, but about why the Sumerians believed their origin was so different from any other creation myth in the ancient world. This wasn't a story about gods moulding humans from dust on a whim. This was a story about desperation, rebellion, and a solution that would change everything. The tablets describe a time before humans existed, when the Anunnaki had divided the cosmos among themselves. The senior gods, the great Anunnaki, ruled from their cities in the heavens and on earth. But someone had to do the actual work. Someone had to dig the canals, tend the fields, mine the minerals from beneath the earth. That burden fell to a lower class of divine beings called the Igigi. For thousands of years, according to the text, the Igigi laboured. They dug irrigation channels that stretched for miles. They worked mines deep in the earth, extracting copper and gold and precious stones. They maintained the infrastructure that kept the divine civilization running. And they grew tired. The breaking point came, the tablets tell us, after 40 years of unending toil. Though whether these were divine years or earthly years, the text doesn't clarify. What's clear is that the Igigi had reached their limit. One night they gathered in secret. They made a decision that would echo through the cosmos. They burned their tools. At midnight they marched on the house of Enlil, the commander of the gods, the one who had assigned them their endless labour. They surrounded his dwelling and declared they would work no more. The tablets describe Enlil's reaction with remarkable psychological detail. He wasn't immediately angry. He was terrified. Here was the chief executive of the divine order, facing a workers' revolt he hadn't seen coming. He sent for the other great gods. Anu, the Sky Father, came down from his celestial palace. Enki, the wise god of the waters and deep knowledge, arrived from his domain in the Abzu, the underground ocean. They convened an emergency council. The question before them was simple but profound. The work had to be done. Civilization, even divine civilization, requires maintenance. Canals silt up. Fields need tending. Resources must be extracted and processed, but the Igigi refused to continue, and there weren't enough senior Anunnaki to do the work themselves. They needed a solution. Enki proposed something unprecedented. Why not create a new being? Something capable of doing the work, intelligent enough to follow instructions and maintain themselves, but not divine. Not capable of rebellion. A primitive worker. The Sumerian term is Lulu, which translates roughly as the mixed one or the primitive worker. The other gods were intrigued but skeptical. How would such a being be made? The tablets describe the process in language that's both poetic and strangely specific. Enki called for Ninmah, the mother goddess, whose expertise was in matters of birth and creation. Together, they devised a method. They would take clay from the earth, the fundamental substance of the material world. But clay alone wouldn't suffice. The new beings needed something more. They needed a spark of divinity, enough to make them intelligent, capable, able to learn and work. The solution was disturbing in its implications. A god would have to die. Not a senior Anunnaki, but one of the Igigi. A volunteer. Or perhaps not a volunteer. The texts aren't entirely clear on this point. What they do specify is that this particular god possessed Ti'ima, usually translated as personality or intelligence. His blood would be mixed with the clay. His divine essence would provide the template for the new species. The tablets describe Ninmah kneading the clay with the blood of the slain god. 14 lumps of this mixture were prepared. 7 would become males, 7 females. Enki spoke incantations over them. Ninmah placed them in what the text calls the creation chamber, possibly some kind of incubation facility. 9 months later, humanity was born. But here's where the story becomes more complex than a simple tale of creating slaves. The first humans were successful beyond what anyone had anticipated. They could indeed do the work. They learned quickly. They developed their own methods, their own innovations. They began to multiply, filling the land. And something unexpected happened. The gods became attached to them. The texts describe Enki in particular developing what can only be called affection for his creations. He watched them with pride. He taught them things beyond their original purpose. Agricultural techniques, healing practices, elements of divine knowledge that perhaps they weren't supposed to have. Other gods noticed this too. Humanity wasn't just functioning as intended. They were exceeding expectations. They were developing culture, language, social structures. They were becoming something more than primitive workers. This created a philosophical divide among the Anunnaki that would define everything that followed. To some gods, led by Enlil, humans were exactly what they'd been designed to be: workers, servants, useful, but ultimately disposable. Their increasing numbers and growing capabilities were concerning, possibly even threatening. They needed to be managed, controlled, kept in their proper place. To other gods, particularly Enki, humanity had become something different. Yes, they served the gods, but they also interested them, amused them, made them feel less alone in the cosmos. The text suggests that Enki saw in humans a reflection of divine potential. They carried divine blood, after all. The essence of a god flowed in their veins, however diluted. What might they become given time and guidance? The tablets record discussions among the divine council about humanity's purpose. Were they slaves? Were they children? Were they worshippers whose prayers and offerings fed divine power? Were they an experiment in creating conscious beings? The Anunnaki themselves seemed uncertain. What's remarkable about the Atrahasis epic compared to other creation myths is this ambiguity. The Hebrew Bible says humans were made in God's image to have dominion over creation. The Greek said Prometheus shaped them from clay out of love. But the Sumerian texts present creation as a practical solution to a labor problem, one that produced unexpected consequences. The gods made humans to serve. But humans became something the gods hadn't quite planned for. Something capable of growth, learning, culture. Something that earned the affection of some gods and the suspicion of others. This tension, this question of whether humanity was property or family, slave or child, would set the stage for everything that followed. Because when Enlil eventually decided that humans had become too numerous, too noisy, too presumptuous, he would propose a solution as drastic as their creation had been, and when he did, the Anunnaki would face a choice that would tear the divine order apart and bring catastrophe to the world. Humanity did exactly what it had been designed to do. It worked. It reproduced. It filled the gaps in the gods' unfinished world. In the Sumerian stories, this didn't take ages of slow growth. Once humans were created and the burden of a labor shifted off the lesser gods, the human population began to climb. Fields that had once lain empty were suddenly crowded with workers. Irrigation canals spread like veins across the land. Cities that had been little more than divine outposts started to buzz with mortal life. The texts describe a time when mankind multiplied, when humans spread out across the plains, along river banks, into every corner of the land the gods had claimed. At first, this was the whole point. Humans were the solution to a problem. The Anunnaki had been exhausted by toil. Humans took over the digging, the planting, the harvesting. Offerings flowed upward. Temples grew rich. But success came with side effects. As more humans were born, more fires burned at night. More voices spoke, argued, sang, cried out in pain and in celebration. More hammers struck stone. More clay was shaped into bricks. More animals were herded and slaughtered. Life became loud. Sumerian texts preserve a strange phrase for this moment: the noise of mankind. According to some versions, it rose up and disturbed Enlil, the god of wind, air, and authority. The stories say the noise kept him from resting, that it troubled his sleep. On the surface, this sounds almost comical. The chief god, annoyed by the neighbours, humanity as a kind of cosmic upstairs apartment with thin walls. But if we sit with it a little longer, the noise starts to feel like something more than literal sound. In a world where the gods had ruled uncontested, humans were suddenly becoming a force. Every new birth meant another pair of hands that didn't just work but thought, remembered, planned. Every new generation carried stories from the one before, and those stories slowly accumulated into something that looked very much like culture. From the human perspective, this was a natural progression. You learn where the rivers flood, which grains grow best, how to read the stars for planting and travel. You build on your parents' knowledge, then pass it on to your own children. Over time, that noise becomes law codes, myths, songs, technical know-how. It becomes cities and systems. From Enlil's perspective, it might have looked different. Enlil was the god of order, of decrees, of boundaries that were supposed to be obeyed. Humanity had been created as a labour class, a dependent species kept in place by offerings, rituals, and fear. But as humans multiplied, their presence began to reshape the environment, to complicate the tidy hierarchy the gods had established. The noise might have been the roar of human activity, yes, but it may also have symbolized something deeper: human restlessness, human curiosity, a growing refusal to stay quietly in the corner of creation they'd been assigned. Later Mesopotamian stories, like the tale of the building of great towers and cities, echo this anxiety. Humans gathering together, organizing themselves, reaching upward with bricks and bitumen. From the ground it was ambition. From the heavens it might have looked like encroachment. And then there was the matter of knowledge. Many traditions from the ancient Near East hint at episodes where humans gained access to skills and understanding that were supposed to be reserved for the divine. Secret names of plants, the workings of the heavens, the arts of metal, of writing, of magic. In some versions, these gifts come from gods who are sympathetic to humanity. In others, they come from beings who act in defiance of the established order. In Mesopotamian texts, Enki often plays this ambiguous role. As the god of wisdom, fresh water, and subterranean knowledge, he embodies the hidden currents beneath the surface of reality. He's the one who knows how things actually work, and he seems to have a soft spot for humans. There are hints that Enki, or those aligned with him, shared more with humanity than Enlil ever intended. Instructions, perhaps, techniques, maybe even parts of the divine the decrees or blueprints of civilization that governed crafts, kingship, and culture. When mortals started acting with a little too much confidence, when they began to handle sacred technologies, or step into roles that had once been reserved for the gods alone, that too may have been part of the noise. And then the boundary between gods and humans began to blur in another way. Scattered through Mesopotamian traditions are references to beings who seem to stand between mortal and divine. Great kings described as born of a god and a human mother, heroes with impossible strength and endless lifespans. In the Sumerian king list, the earliest rulers are said to have reigned for thousands of years, as if they were something other than ordinary men. Elsewhere, we hear of the children of the gods, beings who move through the world with power that feels not quite human. The details are often fragmentary, broken on clay tablets damaged by time. But the overall impression is clear. The gods did not always keep themselves apart. There was intermingling, crossing of categories that were supposed to remain distinct. This theme isn't unique to Sumer. In the Hebrew Bible, a related tradition speaks of sons of God who saw that the daughters of men were beautiful and took them as wives. Their offspring were the Nephilim, giants, mighty ones of old, men of renown. They were so troubling, so destabilizing to the cosmic balance, that their appearance is directly connected to the decision to send a world-destroying flood. Greek myths tell similar stories of gods consorting with mortals, producing heroes like Heracles, Perseus, Achilles. In many indigenous traditions worldwide, there are tales of sky people, star visitors, or divine ancestors who mate with humans and leave behind lineages that are more than merely human. It's easy to dismiss these as just stories. But even as stories, they reveal something about how ancient people saw the origin of power, kingship, and social hierarchy. The idea that rulers or heroes carried divine blood served to justify their authority. But it also implied that the line between heaven and earth was dangerously permeable. For a god like Enlil, responsible for maintaining order, this mingling could look like contamination. A breakdown of categories. Gods behaving like humans, humans claiming a share in divinity. Hybrid beings walking the earth with agendas of their own. If human numbers were spiraling upward, if their cultures were becoming more complex, if some of them carried traces of divine power or forbidden knowledge, then the world was no longer the simple arrangement envisioned at the beginning. Gods above, humans below, each in their place. The Mesopotamian texts hint that Enlil's irritation hardened into something darker. First came attempts to limit humanity, reducing lifespans, sending plagues, withholding rain, trying to dial back the multiplication, the noise, the encroaching human presence. Each measure was a kind of cosmic population control, an effort to restore the earlier balance. But the stories also suggest that these attempts never fully succeeded. Humans adapted. They found ways to survive droughts. They made offerings to appease the gods during epidemics. They sought help from other divine powers. And standing most consistently on the side of humanity is Enki. Whenever harsh decrees are issued against humans, Enki seems to look for loopholes. Where Enlil sees a dangerous infestation threatening cosmic order, Enki sees his own creation, fragile, flawed, but also capable of learning, of loyalty, of gratitude. He advocates, he intervenes, sometimes openly, sometimes in secret. In this growing tension between Enlil and Enki, between control and compassion, between order and curiosity, we can feel the pressure building. The gods had made humans to solve a problem, but in doing so, they had created a new one, a species that multiplied, that questioned, that crossed boundaries, that refused to stay small and silent. According to the ancient stories, there would come a moment when Enlil decided that partial measures were no longer enough. If humanity could not be contained, it would have to be removed. That decision, and Enki's response to it, would bring the divine conflict to a breaking point, and set the stage for the greatest catastrophe the ancient world ever remembered. In the Sumerian stories, that pressure takes the form of a feud, not just between two personalities, but between two visions of what humanity was for. On one side stood Enlil, lord of wind and command, the god of decrees and destiny, guardian of divine order. On the other stood Enki, lord of the subterranean waters, the wise trickster, the god of ingenuity and loopholes. They weren't just brothers, they were opposites. Enlil's world was clear and rigid. Every being had its place. The gods ruled, humans served, the boundaries were not to be crossed. Enki's world was flexible, full of workarounds. If a line could be drawn, it could also be bent. If a rule existed, there might be a clever way around it. At first, this tension showed up in small ways. Enlil imposed quotas, Enki softened the terms. Enlil demanded stricter rituals. Enki taught humans how to meet the bare minimum with maximum efficiency. But as humanity multiplied, so did the gods' impatience. The texts describe the human noise as rising like a storm, disturbing the gods' rest, filling the temples and the nights with endless demands. In one Akkadian version, the gods complain they can't sleep. To the Enlil faction, the solution seemed simple. If humans are becoming too numerous, too loud, too independent, then reduce them. Not by open slaughter, that would violate the cosmic balance, but by nudging the environment itself. Twist the levers of nature that only the gods could touch. That's when the plagues begin. In the myths, these catastrophes don't come out of nowhere. They follow divine meetings, councils where Enlil speaks, and the other great gods listen. Decisions are made in secret. No thunderbolt, no dramatic showdown. Just a quiet decree, and then, suddenly, things start to go wrong on Earth. First, disease. The texts speak of pestilence sweeping through the land. People weaken, livestock die. The breath of life itself seems to thin. To a Sumerian, this wasn't an accident. Illness was often a message from the gods, a sign that someone, somewhere, had broken the cosmic rules. But the stories add another layer. They hint that this was not just punishment, but policy, a targeted reduction. Enki watches this unfold and faces a dilemma. He has sworn oaths in the divine council, but he has also, again and again, taken the side of humans. Nothing in these myths is simple loyalty. Enki is bound to his fellow gods, yet fascinated by the fragile beings labouring in the fields and canals. They carry some of his design. They are, in a way, his project. So he interferes, not openly, not in a way that would let Enlil catch him breaking the command. Instead, he slips help into the cracks. He teaches humans new ways to purify water, new herbs to treat fevers, new rituals to appease lesser gods who might intercede on their behalf. The stories describe him sending dreams, sending instructions, sending wisdom disguised as chance discovery. In one tradition, when a plague god is unleashed, Enki quietly raises a counterforce, another god, another spirit, a different wind, to blunt the impact. The epidemic still comes, but fewer die than Enlil intended. From the human point of view, it must have felt like chaos. One year the gods smile, the next invisible forces move through the air and people drop with no warning. Then a healer appears, claiming to have received knowledge in a dream. A new prayer works when older ones fail. Survival becomes a matter not just of hard work, but of navigating unseen politics in heaven. When the plague fails to break humanity, the council tries something harsher. Famine. The myths describe years when grain simply will not grow. The soil is the same, the fields are the same, but the rains of abundance are withheld. Enlil, the god who controls the winds and the weather, turns the sky into a weapon. Harvests shrink, storehouses empty, markets fall silent. Again, Enki refuses to watch in silence. He doesn't conjure bread out of thin air. That would be too obvious, too defiant. Instead, he teaches new techniques. How to irrigate more carefully, how to choose seeds that might survive lean seasons, how to dig deeper into the sweet groundwater of the Apsu, the freshwater abyss he rules. He whispers to rulers to open their granaries, to ration, to store. Some tablets preserve hints of regional variation in disaster. One city wastes away, another survives by clever adaptation. To a literal mind, this might seem like random weather. To a Sumerian scribe, it looked like factional war. One region under Enlil's direct displeasure, another quietly shielded by Enki's favour. But not all gods saw the conflict in the same way. Around these two elder brothers, younger deities began to choose sides. Ninhursag, the mother goddess who helped in human creation, often appears leaning toward mercy, toward Enki's vision. Others, like Ninurta, Enlil's warrior son, embody the stricter line, order before compassion, obedience before innovation. And then there was Inanna, Ishtar in later Akkadian tradition. She is one of the most complex figures in the Mesopotamian pantheon, goddess of love and war, of sexuality and kingship, of the morning and evening star. Inanna doesn't fit cleanly into either camp. She moves where advantage lies. She supports cities and kings who honor her, but she also topples rulers when it suits her ambitions. In the myths, you can feel her circling the core conflict like a hawk. On one hand, she benefits from growing human civilization. More cities mean more temples, more soldiers, more trade, more offerings to her name. On the other hand, chaos and war are her domains. A world constantly on the edge of disaster keeps her powerful. Some texts show her aligning with Enlil's authority, especially when it grants her the divine me, the decrees and cultural powers that structure civilization. In other stories, she seeks knowledge from Enki, drinking his wisdom like strong beer, tricking him into handing over the very rules that make cities possible. She's not simply a spectator. She's an opportunist in a divine cold war, and the war continues to escalate. After plague and famine come droughts. The Mesopotamian world depended completely on the balance between the Tigris and Euphrates. Too little water and the fields withered, too much and the rivers destroyed the very land they fed. The texts describe years when canals run low, the ground cracks, wells fail. Drought is different from a bad harvest. It is a sustained withdrawal of blessing. A long, slow suffocation. Once more the pattern repeats. Enlil decrees, the natural order shifts, humans suffer, Enki quietly sabotages total collapse. In some versions he instructs selected humans to dig new channels, to move to safer ground, to change their planting cycles. Survival becomes a test of who listens to which god. The younger gods watch and learn. Some begin to specialize in particular disasters. A god of disease, a god of storms, a goddess of healing, each with their own loyalties and grudges. Others become patrons of specific cities, turning human politics into extensions of divine rivalry. When one city rises and another falls, it is interpreted not as chance, but as the victory of one divine faction over another. Scholars reading across multiple tablets notice something striking. These aren't isolated tales of random punishment. They form a sequence: plague, famine, drought, each more severe than the last, each framed as a deliberate decision made in heaven, each partially undermined by Enki's sympathy for humans. It looks, in mythic form, like a strategy, a series of escalating measures to cut down humanity without destroying them entirely, a controlled reduction, a pressure campaign. But pressure, once applied, tends to build. Every time Enki intervenes, he saves lives, but he also prolongs the conflict. Every time Enlil's plans are blunted, his frustration grows. The council meetings become more charged. The noise of humanity, the constant pleas, the endless work of managing a restless new species, all of it weighs heavier on the elder god. Somewhere in those hidden deliberations, a new idea begins to take shape. Not another targeted plague or temporary famine. Not a limited drought. Something cleaner, final, a reset. The texts don't show us the exact moment the thought is born. They only hint that after all the failed attempts to control humanity, Enlil starts considering a different kind of solution. One that wouldn't just thin the herd, but erase almost all of it. A decree not of reduction, but of annihilation. And at the edge of this decision the waters begin to stir. The decision, when it finally came, did not erupt in thunder and lightning. It arrived the way most world-ending choices do, quietly, in a meeting. The Sumerian texts describe it in fragments, like the memory of a nightmare you can't quite shake. The great gods assembled, not in the open courtyards of their temples, not in the bustling cities filled with their human servants, but in a hidden place, a remote heaven, a distant chamber, somewhere beyond the reach of mortal eyes and ears. This was the divine council in crisis mode. Humanity had grown too numerous, too noisy, too unpredictable. earlier complaints in the tablets sound almost mundane. People crowding the land, multiplying without restraint, their clamour keeping the gods awake at night. Grain rations disrupted, labour demands impossible to manage, cities stretching into places once reserved for the divine. What had begun as a clever solution to menial labour had become, in Enlil's eyes, an infestation. The earlier problems could be fixed with plagues, droughts, famines, temporary corrections, but those had failed. Every time humanity was cut down, it rebounded. Faster, denser, louder. It wasn't just a nuisance anymore. It was to Enlil a threat to divine order itself. So the council convened to discuss what the texts call the secret word of the gods. Not policy, not adjustment, finality. You can almost hear the tension in the lines. Enlil, the authority of heaven and earth, demanding a solution once and for all. Other gods, lesser but still powerful, hesitating, negotiating, trying to soften the edge of his anger. Enki, the trickster scientist, the one who had helped design humanity, sitting in the council knowing that whatever was decided would fall hardest on the beings he had shaped and championed. Then the decree, not just a punishment, a wiping clean. The decision was to annihilate humanity entirely. No survivors, no remnant, no second chance. The earth would be scrubbed, the noise silenced, the failed experiment reset. In Sumerian terms, it was the revocation of me, the divine ordinances that give structure to reality. In modern language, it was a hard reboot. But how do gods erase a species they themselves engineered? The weapon they chose was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its consequences: water. The texts hint that this was not some random storm. It was a planned deluge, a controlled catastrophe. A flood to destroy the seed of mankind, as later versions echo. Not a flood here or there, but a total submergence. Rivers overflowing, seas rising, the boundary between sky and ocean collapsing. To keep the plan from unravelling, Enlil went further. Every god present was bound by oath, a vow of silence. They were not merely agreeing to the destruction, they were swearing never to warn humanity about it. One of the most haunting lines in these tablets is short and cold. The gods swore by Anu and Enlil. In other words, they bound themselves under the highest authority they knew. Break this oath, and you weren't just disobeying a superior, you were tearing at the fabric of divine law itself. For a mortal, this would be like promising your entire family you would not save a child from a burning house. For a god whose identity was tied to wisdom and protection, it was worse. This is where Enki's crisis begins. He had been there from the beginning, when humans were formed from clay mixed with divine essence, when they were taught irrigation, writing, weaving, metallurgy. He was the patron of craftsmen, of clever solutions, of life-preserving tricks. Now he sat in a council that had decided all of that would be washed away, bound to silence, yet responsible for the beings about to be drowned. Later traditions make Enki almost sympathetic by default, but in the oldest Sumerian accounts, his struggle isn't presented as sentimental. It's practical and moral at the same time. He understands systems. He knows that wiping out humanity isn't just removing noisy labourers, it's collapsing the entire network of temples, offerings and reciprocal relationships that sustain the gods themselves. If the humans vanish, who maintains the canals? Who tends the shrines? Who keeps the ritual calendar? Who recites the hymns? Who replenishes the food offerings? The gods had deliberately structured reality so they would be fed, clothed and honoured by human effort. Erase that, and you don't just solve a nuisance, you dangerously destabilise the entire arrangement. Yet Enlil's decision stands. In the texts, the flood is not an accident, it is a scheduled event. This is where interpretation opens up. From one angle, the flood is purely mythic, The gods decide, the skies open, the freshwater goddesses break their boundaries, the subterranean waters rise and the world drowns. A divine tantrum scaled up to planetary proportions. From another angle, some researchers see hints of technology and astronomy hiding in the poetic language. A command given in the divine assembly that triggers forces far beyond human control. Was this metaphor for aligning celestial cycles, knowing that a particular orbital pattern, a wobble in the Earth's axis, or a series of extreme tides was coming, and framing it as a deliberate act? Or were the gods in this story's preserving memory of advanced methods, terraforming tools, atmospheric manipulations, even orbital weapons, that could destabilize ice sheets and oceans? Others imagine orbital anomalies, a passing massive body, a comet impact in the sea, a sudden shift in climate triggered by cosmic events. If high-ranking gods were simply a previous more advanced civilization with deep astronomical knowledge, then the Secret Council becomes a meeting of scientists and rulers who know a major Earth change is imminent. They choose not to share that knowledge widely, fearing chaos, or perhaps believing humanity has become too dangerous to save. The tablets themselves do not spell out mechanisms in modern terms. They speak instead of opening the sluices of heaven, breaking the bolts of the deep, calling down the storm. To ancient listeners, this meant divine agency. To modern ears, it sounds eerily like someone activating massive environmental controls, releasing stored water, or deliberately destabilizing boundaries that had held for ages. Whatever the mechanism, the plan required one thing above all: secrecy. Preparations begin in the divine realm, not on the ground. The gods withdraw their favor. Omens are either suppressed or interpreted misleadingly. Temples that once overflowed with guidance fall silent or give cryptic readings. The texts say the gods kept their counsel, a phrase that suggests more than simple quiet. It implies misinformation, misdirection, the careful concealment of a pending disaster. For humans, life went on. Fields were planted, harvests were brought in, marriages arranged, children born, houses built a little closer to a river, a little nearer the sea. If there were signs, a strange dimming of the sun, odd tides, unusual storms, they were probably explained away in familiar terms. The gods are angry. The gods will be appeased, bring more offerings, sing longer hymns. But above, in the hidden council chamber, the countdown had already started. Enki, bound by the oath, is caught between two loyalties: to the divine order he helped build, and to the humans whose survival, in a sense, measures his own success. The texts leave gaps here, but you can feel the weight of his hesitation. To stay silent is to participate in genocide. To speak is to break a sacred vow and risk fragmentation of the divine hierarchy. As the date of the deluge draws near, the narrative tightens. The gods begin quietly withdrawing from human cities. Protective deities abandon their shrines. Guardian spirits step back from their posts. Ritual calendars slip slightly out of sync. Festivals feel somehow hollow. The world continues as usual on the surface, but spiritually it is being unplugged. In some versions, the gods described as restless, pacing like caged animals before a storm. Even they seem uneasy with what has been set in motion. Once you release that much water, there is no rewind button, no partial undo. The tablets use phrases like, "no one could oppose," "no one could revoke," signaling a point of no return. That is the moment just before Enki breaks. Bound by oath, compelled by conscience and armed with knowledge no human possesses, he stands on the edge of the ultimate betrayal, of his fellow gods, or of his own creations. The decree of annihilation has been spoken. The mechanism for the flood is ready. Silence is all that keeps humanity blind, and silence for Enki is becoming impossible to bear. Enlil's decree had gone out. The decision was sealed. In the councils of the gods the matter was closed. Humanity would be erased by a flood so vast that even the memory of cities would be washed from the earth. But one god did not let it rest. Enki, lord of the deep waters, god of wisdom and clever solutions, faced a problem that was not just moral, but technical. The divine assembly had sworn an oath of secrecy. No god was allowed to warn humans directly. To break that oath was to risk exile, punishment, maybe even annihilation. And yet the texts hint that Enki saw something the others did not. Where Enlil saw noise and rebellion, Enki saw potential. The humans were clumsy, loud, and often foolish, but they were also adaptable, inventive, and desperately alive. Wiping them out completely, in Enki's view, may have been more than a crime. It may have been a mistake. So he did what beings of intelligence do when a direct path is blocked. He looked for a loophole. In the Sumerian version of the story, the man destined to survive is called Ziusudra. In the Akkadian and Babylonian versions, he appears as Utnapishtim or Atrahasis. The names change, the role does not. He is the listener, the one human whose obedience and piety earn him a place in a drama far bigger than himself. But Enki cannot simply appear in front of him and say, "A flood is coming. Build an ark." The oath forbids it. So the god of wisdom speaks to something else. In one of the oldest versions, Enki addresses a structure, a boundary, a thing that is neither god nor man. He speaks to the reed wall of Ziusudra's dwelling. He calls to the house, to the barrier that separates inside from outside, safety from danger, ignorance from knowledge. Reed wall, house of reed, he begins. It sounds absurd on the surface. Why is a god talking to construction materials? But this is where the cleverness lies. He is not, strictly speaking, warning a human. He is speaking to the wall. If Ziusudra hears the words, well, that's not technically forbidden. The texts preserve fragments of this whispered message. The words come through like an echo from another age. Tear down your house and build a boat. Abandon wealth. Seek life, spurn possessions, save your soul. In some versions, the instructions are more precise. The boat, call it an ark, a barge, a floating sanctuary, is not random. It is engineered. Its dimensions are enormous, often described as being as wide as it is long, forming a kind of massive cube or square-based vessel. This is not a sleek ship designed to sail. It is a survival platform designed to float. The instructions emphasize stability over elegance. Build it of strong wood, say the texts, line it with pitch inside and out. Make it sealed, watertight, a capsule against chaos. In Akkadian accounts, the boat is divided into multiple decks, with compartments arranged like a miniature city. Animals have their places, people have theirs. Stores of food and offerings to the gods are carefully laid out. 7 stories, 9 sections, a bewildering geometry of survival. The details shift slightly between Sumerian, Akkadian and Babylonian retellings, but the pattern is the same. This is not a mythic raft thrown together in panic. It is a planned structure, built according to a blueprint provided by a god who understands both water and design. And then there is the question of who gets on board. Was Ziusudra chosen because of bloodline, a favoured descendant of priestly or royal stock? The Sumerian lists hint that he was a king, a ruler of Shuruppak, a city that would soon be erased by the flood. Was this about preserving a particular genetic line, a thread of divine human connection the gods considered too valuable to lose? Or was it about character? The Akkadian Atrahasis is described as exceedingly wise. Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh is portrayed as God-favoured, devout, careful in offerings. These stories emphasize more than just birth. They point to qualities the gods valued: obedience, the ability to listen, the willingness to act without full understanding. It's also possible that these tales blend all three explanations, bloodline, worthiness, and divine favour, into one. If you were a Mesopotamian scribe shaping this story on a clay tablet, what better justification for survival than a combination of lineage, piety, and approval from a sympathetic god? Whoever precisely Ziusudra was, he isn't alone on the ark. Again and again, the texts stress the idea of seeds of life, not just pairs of animals, as later retellings would emphasize, but something broader, almost scientific in its phrasing. Bring aboard the seed of all living things. In some versions, this means animals, domesticated herds, wild creatures, birds of the sky, beasts of the field. But the ancient audience would have understood seeds literally as well. Grains, date palms, barley and wheat, the raw materials of agriculture and civilization. Perhaps even more abstract seeds, knowledge, crafts, rituals, the patterns of life that keep a culture alive. You can almost imagine Ziusudra's household racing to gather not just food, but tools, tablets, symbols, family emblems, anything that could be used to rebuild a world after the waters recede. All of this has to be done quickly. The flood is not a vague threat in some distant future. It is imminent. The tone in the surviving lines is urgent. There is no time to argue, no room for doubt. Dismantle your house, sell what you can, turn everything you own into raw materials and labour, build now, and above all keep it quiet. Enki's warning cannot become public knowledge. If the plan spreads too far, the other gods will notice, the assembly will intervene, the loophole will close, so the work of salvation becomes a secret project. Imagine the tension. A massive vessel rising in a city that has never seen such a thing. Neighbours whispering. Labourers wondering what they are building. Explanations given, perhaps, that this is a temple, a ritual barge, a divine offering. Anything but what it truly is. A lifeboat for a doomed world. Different Mesopotamian traditions remember this warning in different ways. The early Sumerian version with Ziusudra focuses on the piety of the king and the favour of the god. The Akkadian Atrahasis story gives more detail on the argument between Enlil and Enki, framing the warning as part of a long-standing dispute over how to control humanity, through destruction or through adjustment. The later Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh reshapes the tale again, putting Utnapishtim at the centre and using his survival as a lesson about the limits of human ambition. Across all of them, the core element remains. A god bound by an oath finds a way to speak without speaking, to warn without warning. The reed wall becomes a legal fiction, a narrative device, and perhaps a hint that the ancients understood something subtle about rules, intentions, and technicalities. Seen this way, Enki's act is not just compassion, it is rebellion. He is defying the will of the majority, not by open confrontation, but by subversion. By protecting one family, one thread of life, Enki undermines the absolute finality of Enlil's judgment. He turns total annihilation into a reset instead of an ending. The flood will still come, cities will still vanish, most of humanity will still perish, but not all. And that not all is everything. It is the difference between a universe where the gods can unmake their creations with no residue, and a universe where, even at the highest level of power, dissent exists. Mercy slips through the cracks. Loopholes matter. In that hidden space between oath and intention, between decree and exception, the future of humankind is smuggled onto a boat. Enki's secret warning is the hinge of the story. Before it, the gods have all the power. After it, a single human knows something the rest of humanity does not, that the world is about to end, and that there is, if he moves quickly and quietly enough, a way through. The ancient texts don't begin the flood with a single dramatic crash of thunder. They start with a tension in the air, a sense that the world itself is holding its breath. In the Sumerian and Akkadian accounts, the decision has already been made. The divine council has pronounced its sentence. Humanity, noisy, multiplying, hard to control, is to be erased. But on the ground, in the cities of the plain, in the reed huts and brick houses along the rivers, people go about their lives as if nothing is wrong. Then the signs begin. The winds shift. Clouds gather that do not behave like normal clouds. The rivers, which have always risen and fallen with the seasons, begin to swell out of rhythm, as if responding to a different command. Animals grow restless. Birds lift off in great flocks, abandoning the lowlands. To the people below, this is strange, but not yet unimaginable. Floods have come before, droughts have come before. The gods give and the gods take away. But this time in the stories, the sky and the earth make a pact. When the texts describe the flood's onset, they use phrases that sound less like weather and more like a cosmic rupture. The gates of heaven are opened. The foundations of the earth are broken. The subterranean freshwater ocean, the Apsu, the great deep under the land, bursts upward. Rain doesn't just fall. It lashes down in sheets so dense you can't see an arm's length ahead. The rivers don't just overflow, their banks simply vanish as water pours out from everywhere at once. One tablet describes 7 howling winds unleashed together, raging across the land. Another says the storm god himself rides at the front of the tempest, thundering, hurling lightning, tearing roofs from houses and trees from the ground. Mountains shake. City walls crumble, not slowly but all at once, as if some invisible hand simply pushes them over. The flood in these accounts isn't a natural disaster that gets out of control. It's a military operation carried out by the sky. The storm flattened the land like a battle, one line says. Fields, orchards, temples, everything is treated as if it were an enemy army. The difference is that this army cannot flee. There is nowhere dry to run to. The heavens have opened and the earth has broken, and between those two vast, merciless forces humanity is trapped. The texts are strangely detailed about the sounds of that moment. Not poetic thunder, but the shrieks of timbers snapping, the grinding roar of houses torn apart, the desperate cries of people and animals drowning together. It's not the water itself that's described as the worst part. It's the noise, the sheer overwhelming assault on the senses, the feeling that the world's familiar boundaries, river and bank, sky and land, city and wilderness, have all dissolved. And still the water rises. In the stories, even the gods are unsettled by what they've set in motion. This is one of the most striking things about the Mesopotamian flood traditions. The gods who ordered the destruction don't stand confidently and watch. They retreat. While the storm rages, the pantheon flees to the highest heaven. The heaven of Anu, a realm so distant that even divine beings must climb to reach it. Up there, above the storm, they huddle like frightened birds, pressed against the outer ramparts of the sky. There is one passage that survives in multiple versions, repeated almost like a refrain. The gods cowered like dogs. These are beings who command the winds and the deep, who decree life and death. Yet when the unleashed forces begin to work, even they seem to realize that they've called up something bigger than themselves. The storm grows wild, the waters roar louder than intended, and the line between punishment and annihilation begins to blur. In that clamour one voice stands out. Ishtar, goddess of love and war, the bright star of the morning and evening sky, looks down on the drowning world and breaks. In the Akkadian epic, her lament is raw and almost shockingly human. She cries that she spoke evil in the assembly of the gods. She wails that she ordered the destruction of her own people, her own creations. "What have I done?" she asks. "I gave birth to my people, and now they fill the sea like fish." She clutches at her jewels, the symbols of her power and authority, and now they feel meaningless. Her words accuse no one by name, but the implication is clear. The decision of the divine council has gone too far. This is no longer a necessary cleansing. It is a horror. The other gods are silent. Enlil, who drove the decree, is absent from these frightened gatherings. Enki, who whispered the warning to build the boat, says nothing here. The storm continues, shattering the boundary between heaven and earth, and the beings who ordered it can only watch and shudder. The texts give different numbers for how long the deluge lasted. 7 days and 7 nights of unbroken storm in one version. 6 days in another, a week essentially in all of them. Not a gentle week of constant rain, but a single unrelenting assault where night and day lose their meaning. Imagine 7 entire cycles of sunrise and sunset, and never once does the sky clear. By the time the storm ends, the world, at least the part of it that matters to the story, is gone. Cities are erased, fields are stripped of soil. Livestock, wild herds, even forests have disappeared beneath a limitless grey-brown sea. In one line, the survivor looks out from his boat and sees only the tops of mountains, like islands in an endless ocean. Everything that once marked human presence is gone. There's just water, wind, and the creaking of the ark's timbers as it rides the swells. How big was this flood, really? This is where the story moves from myth to the hazier space of possibility. Most geologists and archaeologists don't see evidence for a single global flood that covered every mountain on Earth. The planet's rock layers just don't support that. But that doesn't mean there were no floods of almost unimaginable scale. Some researchers point to the rapid flooding of the Black Sea basin at the end of the last ice age, when rising Mediterranean waters may have poured in over a relatively narrow strait, turning a smaller inland lake into a huge inland sea in a geological instant. Others look to the Mesopotamian plain itself, a land built from river sediments, where the Tigris and Euphrates have always been capable of catastrophic flooding when their channels shift or when distant rains cascade down from the mountains. Excavations at ancient cities like Shuruppak and Ur, the very places linked to flood heroes in the texts, have revealed thick layers of water-laid silt between older and newer habitation levels. These strata don't prove a world-destroying deluge, but they do point to massive regional floods that would have felt, to the people who lived through them, like the end of everything. Now imagine if one of those floods hit a region already dense with early urban life. Brick cities on low flood plains, warehouses packed with grain, canals and irrigation systems carefully balanced against the rivers. A truly exceptional inundation could wipe all of that away in a matter of days. To survivors, it would not be a big flood. It would be the flood, the dividing line between the world that was and the world that came after. In the stories, when the waters finally begin to recede, the drama doesn't end with triumphant music or the sudden return of sunlight. It ends with silence. The storm winds slacken. The rain thins to drizzle, then mist, then nothing. The waves grow less violent. The deep stops roaring and settles into a heavy, suffocating calm. The ark runs aground on the shoulder of a mountain. The survivor waits and waits and waits, because even when the sky's clear, the world still looks dead. Birds are sent out, first one, then another, then a third, to test the distance between water and land. The first returns, finding nowhere to rest. The second circles and comes back. Only the last fails to return, a small sign that somewhere, beyond the horizon of water, there is something solid again. But in that moment, with the boat resting on a mountain and the fog lifting from the drowned valleys, what the texts emphasize is not relief. It's emptiness. No city noises, no temple bells, no shouts from marketplaces or songs from fields. The gods, who once complained that humans were too loud, now find that silence is worse. The survivor steps out onto the newly exposed land, builds an altar, and sends up the smoke of sacrifice. And the texts say the gods gather like flies around the offering. It isn't just the smell of food that draws them. It's the first sign that the terrible quiet might be broken. Between the world destroyed and the world reborn there is this pause, the still water, the stunned heavens, the lone human family standing between memory and possibility. The deluge has passed, but nothing is yet secure. The old order has been washed away. What replaces it, and what the gods will demand in exchange for letting humanity return, is the question that waits on the far side of the flood. Then, finally, impact. In the Atrahasis and Gilgamesh traditions, the vessel comes to rest on a mountain. Not a gentle beach, not a riverbank, but high, jagged rock pushing through the surface of the flood like a survivor's last breath. The exact peak depends on the version. The Sumerians speak of Mount Nisea. Later Babylonians say Ararat. The detail shifts, but the image is strangely consistent. A massive boat, wedged on a summit that was never meant to hold it, tilting slightly to one side like a stranded animal. Inside, it's quiet. Not the silence of peace, but the silence after terror. Days without the sound of rain hammering the roof. Days without the creak and groan of wood fighting to stay whole. Just breathing. The shuffling of animals. The faintest moan of wind outside. The hero, Ziusudra in Sumer, Atrahasis in Akkad, Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, waits. He doesn't fling open the door and rush out into the light. He tests. In one version he releases a dove. It circles and returns, finding nowhere to land. Then a swallow. Same story. Only when a raven goes out and does not come back does he know the waters have truly begun to retreat. Somewhere, land exists. When the door finally opens, the survivors step into a world that smells wrong. Not of soil and plants and dry dust, but of wet stone, rotting debris and something else, the absence of old life. No trees, no villages, no fields, just mud and scattered carcasses, the waterline still clinging to the rocks like a memory of violence. According to the texts, the hero doesn't rebuild a house, or plant a field, or even search for other survivors. That can wait. Something else has to come first. He builds an altar. This is one of the stranger details in the Mesopotamian flood stories. The very first recorded human act after a world-destroying catastrophe is not practical, it's ritual. Ziusudra or Atrahasis gathers wood, arranges stones, slaughters animals that are themselves some of the last of their kind, and lights a fire. He burns a sacrifice on the mountain top, sending smoke into a sky that has only just stopped tearing the world apart. And then something almost startling happens. The gods smell it. The texts are blunt here. The aroma of roasting meat, of fat and incense rises into the heavens, and the Anunnaki react like starving creatures who haven't eaten in days. One line says, "The gods smelled the savour. The gods gathered like flies over the sacrifice." It's not a compliment. It's a reminder of something the myths hint at again and again. In this worldview, the gods depend on humans, not for their existence, but for their comfort, for offerings, for regular worship. Wipe humanity out, and the divine economy collapses. The great gods, Anu, Enlil, Enki, Ninmah and their peers, draw near. Some texts say they crowd around the altar greedily. Others soften it, describing them as sitting like flies around the smoke. Either way, it's an image of desperate need. The beings who flooded the earth now hover over the first hot meal they've had since they destroyed their cooks. But the reunion is not entirely joyful. Because when Enlil arrives and sees the boat, sees the altar, sees the human figures alive and breathing on a world that was supposed to be empty, he explodes. In the flood myths, Enlil is the architect of the Annihilation, the one who pushed the divine council to agree. To him, survivors are not a relief. They're a betrayal. The texts preserve a sharp confrontation. Enlil demands to know who dared to break the decree, who warned the humans, who revealed the secret of the gods. And all eyes turn to Enki. Enki, the trickster, the god of wisdom, the one who speaks in riddles and dreams, doesn't really deny it. In some versions, he tries to argue on technicalities. He didn't speak to a man directly, he spoke to a reed wall, and the man just happened to be listening. In others, he admits that yes, he gave warning, yes, he helped design the ark, yes, he undermined the divine decision. But then he does something more important. He reframes the entire situation. According to the Atrahasis text, Enki tells Enlil that the plan was wrong from the beginning. Total extermination was excessive, clumsy, even foolish. Humanity was noisy, yes. Numerous, yes. But the flood has shown how deeply the gods rely on them. Without people, the temples are empty. The sacrifices cease. The divine order starts to starve. Enki offers a compromise. Instead of wiping humans out again every time they multiply or annoy the gods, the Anunnaki will change the rules, not of weather, of life itself. The myths describe a new covenant, though they don't use that exact word. A set of changes to the human condition. From now on, people will be mortal in a sharper, more limited way. Lifespans will shorten. Fertility will be restrained. Plague, famine, and stillbirth will enter the world not as random horrors, but as tools for managing population. Death, which had always existed in some form, becomes more present, more inescapable, more tightly woven into the structure of human existence. We can see traces of this shift when we compare different Mesopotamian texts. In the Sumerian king list, rulers before the flood reigned for impossibly long spans, tens of thousands of years. After the flood, the numbers drop dramatically. 1,200 years, then 900, then 120. Eventually, they settle into something closer to the lifetimes we know. The literature seems to be saying, something changed. Whatever human meant before the flood, it has been recalibrated. Enlil, faced with hungry gods and a persuasive Enki, relents. He doesn't soften into kindness. He recalculates. Total destruction is replaced by controlled limitation. Humanity will continue, but as a smaller, weaker, more fragile species, easier to manage, less likely to grow into a threat. In the Gilgamesh epic, this negotiation turns into a personal reward. Utnapishtim and his wife are granted immortality and sent to live far away at the mouth of the rivers. In other versions, the flood hero becomes a kind of priest-king, mediator between gods and the remade human race. Either way, the survivors become liminal figures. Not quite ordinary people anymore, not quite gods. Living reminders of a broken world and a repaired but diminished one. For the Anunnaki themselves, the aftermath is just as transformative. Some texts suggest they reorganize. Before the flood, humanity spreads widely. Temples dot the land, and the gods rule city-states like territorial lords. After the flood, the lists of first cities are reset. Kingship, the Sumerians say, descended again from heaven, and was allotted to specific places, Kish, Uruk, Ur. It's as if the board has been cleared and a new game begun, with stricter rules and tighter boundaries. Other traditions hint that some of the Anunnaki withdraw. They retreat to distant heavens, to the Apsu beneath the earth, to hidden realms no longer directly accessible. Their interventions become less overt, more symbolic. Instead of walking openly among humans, they act through omens, through priests, through dreams and divination. The flood, in this reading, marks the moment when the gods step back, or are forced to step back, from an intimate physical presence in daily human life. At the same time, the dependence revealed by the sacrifice never goes away. Temple rituals become more elaborate after the flood myths are set. Priests feed statues of the gods daily. Processions reenact divine meals. Offerings are carefully measured, recorded, repeated. You could read this as simple piety, or as a lingering anxiety. We saw once what happens when the gods decide humanity is expendable. We also saw how hungry they are without us. The relationship is no longer one of unquestioned awe. It's a fragile bargain. Humans need the gods for order, fertility, protection. The gods need humans for food, worship, and meaning. Both sides have discovered each other's weaknesses. Did the Anunnaki, as some later theories suggest, actually leave the Earth after this? Return to the stars, abandon their cities, and let their former servants inherit the ruins? The ancient texts never say so outright, but they do fall quieter over time about gods walking, speaking, ruling in person. The stories that do survive, of Enlil's fury, Enki's trickery, the frantic gods gathering like flies, read less like current events, and more like memories from a time when heaven and earth collided catastrophically, and then carefully pulled apart. In that gap, between a drowned world and a smaller, more fragile one, the new humanity took shape, mortal, limited, always at risk, but also newly central, not just the playthings of the gods, but their partners in a dangerous, uneasy, inescapable covenant that would define the rest of Mesopotamian history. An echo in flood stories told long after the names Enlil and Enki had faded into whispers. Echoes of that Sumerian flood didn't stay in Mesopotamia. They kept travelling, carried in memories, reshaped in new languages, retold in new religions. When you start laying these stories side by side, from tablets baked in Iraqi clay, to verses whispered in desert tents, to hymns sung on the banks of the Ganges, something strange happens. Patterns start to emerge. Details line up that shouldn't if each story had truly arisen in isolation. The most familiar echo for many people is the biblical story of Noah. On the surface, it feels like a very different world from Ziusudra and Utnapishtim. One god instead of a feuding council, a wooden ark instead of a reed-built boat coated in bitumen, a dove and a rainbow instead of tablets and temple offerings. But when you strip both stories down to their skeletons, the similarities are astonishing. In both the Sumerian and biblical accounts, the gods, or God, decide that humanity has become intolerable. In Sumer, humans are noisy, numerous, disturbing the sleep and authority of the high gods. In Genesis, humans are violent, corrupt, filling the earth with bloodshed. Different reasons, same verdict. The world must be washed clean. A single man is chosen. In Sumer, it's Ziusudra or Utnapishtim, depending on the version. In Genesis, it's Noah. In both cases, the chosen survivor isn't a mighty king or great warrior. He's righteous, pious, obedient, someone who listens, and crucially, someone who receives a secret warning. The pattern continues. A boat is specified, down to surprisingly technical details, dimensions, decks, materials, the way it should be sealed. Animals are gathered, not just one or two, but of every kind. Family is brought aboard, the door is closed, the storm breaks, the flood itself is described almost the same way. Not just heavy rain, but the windows of heaven opened, the fountains of the deep bursting, water rising from above and below, mountains disappearing, humanity wiped out in a single sustained catastrophe. Finally, the ship comes to rest on a high mountain. Birds are sent out to test the waters. When they don't return, or when they find dry land, the survivor knows it's safe to emerge. And then comes the most revealing moment of all, the covenant afterward. In the Sumerian version, the gods regret the extremity of their judgment. They grant Utnapishtim immortality and set a limit. Never again will such a flood be sent to destroy all humankind. In the biblical account, Yahweh smells the pleasing aroma of Noah's sacrifice and makes a similar promise. Never again will a flood destroy all living things. The rainbow becomes the sign of that decision. 2 civilizations, 2 religions, 1 basic storyline. You could explain this by direct borrowing. After all, the Hebrews lived in the same broad region as Mesopotamia. They spent time in exile under Mesopotamian rule. Stories travel with refugees and traders, but the echoes don't stop in the Near East, and that's where things get more interesting. Move east to India. In Hindu tradition, there's the tale of Manu. One day, Manu is washing his hands when a tiny fish begs for protection. He nurses the fish, and it grows and grows and grows, revealing itself to be an avatar of Vishnu. The great fish warns Manu of an oncoming deluge that will destroy the world. Build a boat, the god says, and I will guide you. When the waters rise, Manu ties his ship to the fish's horn and is towed to safety. After the flood, Manu performs a sacrifice, and from it, humanity is renewed. Different details, same skeleton again. A forewarning, a chosen survivor, a constructed refuge, a world-engulfing flood, and a new beginning marked by ritual. Travel farther to ancient China. One of the oldest Chinese flood stories tells of a vast inundation that covers the land for years, leaving only mountain tops visible. The hero Yu doesn't survive in a boat. Instead, he works tirelessly to control the waters, cutting channels, dredging rivers, taming the chaos so people can live again. It's less about annihilation, more about engineering and perseverance. But the core images are there. A world-threatening flood, mountains as the last dry refuges, divine or semi-divine help, and a reordering of the world afterward. Cross the oceans to the Americas, and the theme persists. Among many Native American nations, flood stories form a central part of their oldest traditions. In some Hopi versions, people are warned by Spider Grandmother and escape to the top of a reed that grows into the sky while waters rise below. Pacific Northwest stories tell of humans climbing the highest peaks, tying themselves to great cedar trees as the water surges around them. In Mesoamerican myths, previous world ages end with floods that wipe out earlier kinds of people, making way for new creations. And in the ancient Mediterranean, the Greeks told of Deucalion and Pyrrha. Zeus decides to destroy a corrupt humanity with a flood. Prometheus warns his son Deucalion, who builds a chest, a kind of box-like ark. The waters rise, mountains disappear, and only their little vessel rides out the storm. When they land on Mount Parnassus, the oracle instructs them to throw the bones of their mother behind them. Understanding that mother means earth, they throw stones over their shoulders, and each stone becomes a new person. Once again, divine displeasure, chosen survivors, a vessel, a world-encompassing flood, and a strange rebirth. You can rationalize any one of these stories as coincidence, or as a metaphor, or as cultural borrowing passed along trading routes and conquest roads. But when you see similar flood narratives on almost every populated continent, the question starts to shift. Instead of asking, why does this culture have a flood myth? You start to ask, how did virtually all of them end up with one? One possibility is psychological. Water is powerful and terrifying. Rivers flood, seas surge, storms overwhelm. For early agricultural societies especially, a bad flood could erase years of work in days. It's easy to imagine water becoming a symbol of chaos, of divine anger, of the boundary between life and death. Maybe flood myths kept recurring because the fear they expressed was universal. Another possibility is historical. When the last ice age ended, between about 20,000 and 7,000 years ago, the world's coastlines weren't fixed. They were moving. Vast ice sheets were melting. Sea levels rose by more than 100 meters. Low-lying plains vanished beneath the waves. Shoreline communities saw their lands shrink year after year. Rivers changed course. Lakes overflowed. Deltas drowned. Geologists have identified several dramatic flooding events in this period. One of the most discussed is the Black Sea Deluge hypothesis. According to this idea, around 7,600 years ago, the rising Mediterranean Sea finally overtopped the narrow land bridge at the Bosporus. Salt water poured into the lower Black Sea basin with incredible force, raising water levels rapidly, perhaps meters per year, swallowing villages, fields and coasts along the way. Some researchers imagine people watching as the sea literally advanced up valleys, day by day, devouring their world. Was this the Great Flood behind Near Eastern stories? We don't know. The evidence is debated. Some geologists think the flooding was slower, less catastrophic. Others argue for multiple episodes of rapid sea level rise in different regions. Massive glacial lake outbursts in North America, sudden inundations in Southeast Asia, dramatic changes along the Persian Gulf, which itself was once a fertile river-fed plain before it filled with seawater. For coastal peoples living through these changes, the whole world might very well have seemed underwater. Generations later, those events could condense in memory. Instead of many floods over centuries, there is one flood. Instead of scattered survivors on many hilltops, there is one family on one boat. Oral traditions compress time. They amplify drama. They turn geology into story. That's the strange power of myth. It doesn't work like a modern history book listing dates and coordinates. It blends memory with meaning. It turns disaster into a lesson about ethics, or obedience, or divine mercy. The Sumerian flood story might preserve faint recollections of local river floods, or of older coastlines long lost beneath the Persian Gulf. The biblical story might carry those same echoes, passed through generations of oral storytellers. Hindu, Chinese, Greek, and Native American tales might be doing something similar, taking real experiences of rising water, regional catastrophes, and slow drowning landscapes, and translating them into something unforgettable. Is there one single, original flood from which all these stories spring? Probably not. The earth has drowned and redrawn its shorelines many times. But there may be a deeper common source, the lived experience of humans at the edge of water, watching it rise, unable to stop it. The fear of losing everything overnight, the relief of survival, the desperate hope that it will never happen again. And that may be why the flood story refuses to die. It speaks to our oldest anxieties and our oldest resilience. It reminds us that we are small compared to the forces that shape this planet, but also that a handful of survivors can restart the human story after unimaginable loss. Whether you see it as history encoded in symbol, as shared psychological truth, or as a message from the gods, the flood sits at the place where memory, myth, and geology blur into one another. In the end, all these tales, from Ziusudra to Noah, from Manu to Deucalion, whisper the same warning and the same comfort. The world can end in water. But if you listen, if you prepare, if you hold fast to those you love and the knowledge you carry, the world can also begin again. For a while now you've been walking through a very different kind of landscape. Not ice fields or ancient savannas, but clay tablets and broken myths. The world of Sumer, where cities rose from the mud of southern Mesopotamia, and people whispered that they had not built civilization alone. They said the Anunnaki had shown them how. On those tablets the story is simple and impossible at the same time. A skyborn assembly of gods descends to earth. They measure fields, dig canals, assign ranks, divide the world like administrators drawing up a set of blueprints. They hold councils, argue over territory, complain about the workload. Then they make a decision that changes everything. They create humans. In one version, you're shaped from clay and divine blood, engineered to carry the burden the gods no longer want. In another, you're fashioned with care and intention, a younger, more fragile cousin who needs guidance. In all of them, you end up somewhere in between, servant and child, useful and dangerous. As the story unfolds, the stakes keep rising. Humanity multiplies, learns, builds. Cities spread, temples grow, noise increases. The gods who once nurtured you begin to worry. Some want to protect you, others want to control you, and a few decide that the experiment has gone too far. A council is called, a flood is decreed. The world will be washed clean. But even among gods, there is disagreement. One voice breaks ranks, warns a single human, passes on the plans of heaven in whispered instructions. Build a boat, seal it tight, carry life through the storm. When the waters finally fall, a new balance is struck. The survivors step into a quieter, emptier world under a changed agreement with their creators. That is what the Sumerian records tell us. Not in one smooth narrative, but in fragments, duplicate copies, competing versions, like shards of a vase that will never fit together perfectly again. And standing here at the end, we have to ask, what can we say for sure, and what remains in the realm of possibility? We can say that the Sumerians believed these stories deeply enough to carve them into clay for centuries. We can say that themes from their flood accounts echo across cultures and continents. A chosen survivor, a warning, a vessel, a deluge, a covenant. We can say that their knowledge of astronomy, mathematics and timekeeping was far ahead of what we might expect from the world's first known civilization. But beyond that, the ground gets softer. Were the Anunnaki real beings who walked among early humans, leaving faint fingerprints in our oldest myths? Were they archetypes, psychological projections of power, fear and hope, given names and genealogies so people could make sense of chaos? Or were they something in between, a memory of forgotten teachers, catastrophes and leaders, refracted through centuries of storytelling until fact and symbol became inseparable? Right now, we don't know. The tablets speak, but they don't explain. They aren't footnotes and lab reports. They are voices from a world that thought in poetry and ritual as easily as we think in data and diagrams. To approach them honestly, you have to hold two ideas at once: skepticism and wonder, doubt and curiosity, a commitment to evidence, and a willingness to admit that the evidence we have may be only a small part of what once existed. So as you drift towards sleep, let the question stay open. If the Anunnaki were real, what kind of reality did they inhabit? If they were symbols, why do those symbols keep resurfacing, age after age, culture after culture? What else lies buried beneath riverbeds and ruined cities, waiting for someone to brush away the dust and read the story for the first time in thousands of years? If this journey through the oldest stories of gods and floods and fragile humans has stirred something in you, let it continue. If you'd like to hear more tales from the borderlands between history and myth, you can gently like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let these late-night explorations become a regular part of your nights. And if you feel like sharing, you can leave a comment with where you're listening from. A quiet roll call of modern humans, scattered across the planet, all tuning in to the same ancient whispers. Somewhere in broken tablets and half-remembered legends, there are pieces of truth we haven't yet recognized. Not proof, not certainty, but hints, patterns, echoes. They're waiting in the dark the way fire once waited in dry wood until someone learned how to bring out the spark. For now, the mystery endures. the Anunnaki remain on the threshold between memory and imagination, and perhaps that's where some truths live best. Not as answers carved in stone, but as questions that keep us looking back into the deep past, wondering what our ancestors saw when they first raised their eyes to the sky and decided that they were not alone.